thank you very much to Soka Gakkai, and Joe, thanks to you for having me here. It's an honor and a pleasure, and I should say it's rare to have the privilege to speak to those who are members of an organization that is founded and led by men, like Tsunasaburo Makaguchi and Daisako Ikeda, who appreciate women as builders of peace and key to enabling a culture of peace. So, thank you. The Institute for Inclusive Security, which I direct, is really dedicated to thinking about how to bring other stakeholders into the peace process. And while we focus particularly on bringing women into peace processes, we recognize that there are other stakeholders, others who care about peace, who often are not brought in to the conversation. More broadly, or most broadly, what we're talking about are fundamental flaws in the way peace is constructed around the world. And a key fundamental flaw that we see at Inclusive Security, and that I perceive, is in the way peace processes are actually built, the way they're constructed, and the way they're put together. Today, most peace processes are secret and selective. They involve a narrow cross-section of the population in a closed process that is invisible to many of the stakeholders who most have a role and an interest in peace. Imagine for a minute if you were creating a peace process. Who would you want to have involved? Those with an investment in peace, with an investment in security, with an investment in safety, those most committed to a culture of peace. And yet today, almost universally, the only people who are brought together to negotiate peace are the warriors. Those who have taken up arms in order to get their voices heard, as opposed to those who have refused to take up arms and still seek to be listened to. They're not setting up peace processes in a way that will create the incentives that are proper, that are conducive to peace, and that enable a long-term spirit of reconciliation. So what I mean is often you will get a peace process that will result in an end of hostilities, in an end to gunfire. But the likelihood that that process results in long-term peace, prosperity, stability, and a real culture of peace, as we would call it, are often very slender. Perhaps the best way to think about this, as I narrow down to talk a little bit about women's inclusion in peace processes, would be to tell you a few anecdotes. And forgive me, Joe, but some of them you've heard. At one peace process, when I went to talk to those who were at the table, all men, and I said, why don't you have any women here? Women are probably the majority of your population at this point after years and years of conflict. Why aren't there any women here? Why would we bring women? They would just compromise. Okay. That's the context of a negotiation, but okay. And when I worked with Darfurian women around the negotiations, these were women who had gotten in the 6th round of negotiations. So after 6 rounds of negotiations, they got a voice. I said to them, well, would it make a difference? Why does it matter if you're there or not? Right? We're dealing with a negotiation process that's moving forward, and they said, well, do you know, the agenda was set up for our negotiation, and the top 2 issues on the agenda were how do we divide up power and how do we divide up wealth? And if we were there, our key concern is how do we get security back on the ground? So in terms of the structures and what we're looking for, even in the dialogue, our priorities are completely different. And that would be reflected not only in the dialogue, but in that agenda for peace, where the priorities would shift to say, security on the ground matters. So, with those anecdotes not as definitive proof, but as a good indication of the kinds of challenges that are faced within the structure of peace processes today, I would pose 2 questions for you that I'll discuss briefly, and then we can open up the floor for a conversation. The first is, would it make a difference for others to be involved? Is there evidence? Because after all, I'm just giving you two stories, and they don't necessarily relate to the results of negotiations. And the second would be, why is it so hard to change? If the premise is self-evident that you need to have these other players in the process, why aren't we moving more quickly to change the way these structures are put in place? So in terms of the first question, would it make a difference? I would say yes. And the evidence and the documentation that that is the case is becoming increasingly obvious. Where women have been involved, and I'll say parenthetically that that is extremely rare. UNIFEM, the UN Development Fund for Women, recently published a study that found that less than 5% of the signatories to peace agreements are women. But where women have been involved, it has changed the content and the content of peace agreements and the nature of the negotiations themselves. So you've seen differences in terms of the substance, and you've seen differences in terms of the process. They've added key issues to agreements. In Northern Ireland, you actually saw women at the negotiating table itself, whereas most of the time, the women are playing a role, but it's usually an indirect role. But in Northern Ireland, they had a direct role. And what did you see at the end of those negotiations, which were relatively successful? You saw specifically that women had included provisions for things like unified education, where in places like Bosnia, you didn't have unified education. They felt that that uniform system for educating youth was a key to long-term rebuilding and reconciling society and ensuring that they shared a common view of history, one that they both bought into. In Uganda, when you looked at the negotiated agreement and you talked about whether or not there were differences made by the women who were involved, you saw that the women were the ones who made sure that the ceasefire not only included putting down weapons, but also called for a cessation to sexual violence. You saw that it was the women who put provisions in those agreements that said that when we demobilize combatants, we need to not only deal with getting them back into society, we need to make sure we're providing for their education, their health care, and their retraining. They had a long look, and they inserted that long look into the accord that had been negotiated. In Sudan and Darfur, where an agreement is not stuck, but one was negotiated with one of 3 rebel groups through the Darfur peace agreement, you saw that women put in provisions to ensure that in this society, which was very conservative, wealth sharing for female-headed households and for women was there, so that those female-headed households could have an opportunity to get their property and get jobs and move their families forward in the post-conflict period. Now, it's interesting to note, in almost all of these cases, and in fact, I think in all of the ones I've mentioned this evening, is that the substance of what those women put into the agreement was non-controversial. Nobody was upset that those provisions were in there. They weren't even necessarily debated in any kind of a heated way. What that means is the women were putting forward things that were forgotten because their interests weren't being represented at the table, and they were putting in things that were non-controversial. Now, why is that important in the context of a negotiation? It's important in the context of a negotiation because often you're looking for that thread of commonality that will provide the foundation for a broader negotiation. You need to find something you can agree on to get the ball rolling. And in many cases, the women were providing just that. They were providing the space to move the dialogue among a bunch of warriors into a positive place, such that there was the grounding for a broader agreement. The other thing that was important about what these women were adding in is that often they were the provisions that provided for a long look at what was needed to reinstitute peace and prosperity, the very culture of peace that was supposed to be framed within the construct of the negotiating process. Important things that would not have been there if the women had been there to insert them. Second thing that they were focused on was creating connections back to citizens. As I mentioned earlier, mostly negotiations are very exclusive and very secret and very closed. There's little communication back to the citizens on the ground. They're usually held in a third location, some other location that is not in conflict, so that there is a perceived neutrality. That's fine. But it also means there's a disconnect from the people who need to buy that agreement and implement that agreement. These women cared about creating local ownership. If you look at peace agreements in Guatemala, in Uganda, and in other places around the world, the women are the ones who are saying, we need to create a loop back to the people on the ground so that they know what is going on. For a negotiation to go on for years without a communication back to the citizens on the ground is not going to create a recipe for success. We need to have those lines of communication. And it is these women who say, we're going back. We need to talk to these constituencies. They're often women who have come out of the constituencies. So whereas you have the leaders of the negotiating parties based elsewhere, the women are coming out of their communities to engage in the negotiating process. And we want to go back and communicate. So they provide that link back to the local population that needs to buy into what's been negotiated and move that agenda forward. Third, they're improving the foundation for long-term reconciliation and for reconstruction. They're doing that both because they have these constituencies locally, because they're providing the connection back to civil society, and because they are very often the ones who do service provision within those communities. In Afghanistan during the Taliban period, it was often the women who were providing the healthcare and education, even in the war zones. By bringing them into any dialogue that was around a peace process, you brought in the people who you were going to ask to implement programs, and who often were the only ones who were going to be able to implement those programs in areas too dangerous for the international community to come in. And finally, what else did you see in those negotiations when women were there? You saw a smoother process. The dynamics changed in the room when you had men and women working together to have the negotiations move forward. When I spoke to one of the mediators on the Uganda talks, he said, oh, absolutely it shifted. When we got those women in the room, the balance changed. There was accountability to constituencies in there that had not been there before. When you only had the warring parties negotiating with one another, as opposed to a constituency that related to the communities on the ground, and a constituency that was going to return back to war-torn societies and make the negotiators accountable to those parties back home. It changed the dynamic, and it greased the wheels, this quote, not mine, it greased the wheels of that negotiation. So, the evidence is there. And in fact, a recent study was published, the first quantitative study that talked about the role of women and also civil society, and said that peace agreements are more durable when there is a greater degree of openness and a broader extent of participation in those peace agreements. If it's so clear, why is it so hard to make change as we see this evidence? What is pushing up against the seeds of change and planting those and helping them grow? I think there are three main challenges. The first is inertia. The vast majority of peace processes today are conducted by a male mediator who has been either a political figure in a country somewhere or a mediator before, with combatants to that conflict in a table in a closed room with a very limited number of observers, most of whom come from third countries, observer countries. Inertia, the word, yeah. Inertia is a resistance to change. So an unwillingness to start to envision things differently and to move in that direction. That willingness to continue to do the same thing it pushes up against an enormous fear about trying to do things differently and failing. It's easy to do the same thing that everyone has done before, that has succeeded some percentage of the time, than it is to try something completely different and new and risk failing and standing out for the fact that you didn't do it the way everybody did it before, and it generally has worked. And so it becomes very difficult to move institutions, and particularly big bureaucracies, to do things differently when there is no incentive to change the way things have been done in the past. The second is a fear of the unknown. While there is a potentially greater upside to doing things better, there's a significant downside if it doesn't work. And if you don't know what the impact is of the changes you want to impose, then you worry about those unintended consequences. And there's a great deal of dialogue when you talk about a peace process, about the risks of bringing other actors into the room. What do I risk by having other people seeing what I'm doing, seeing how I'm negotiating, and seeing what the shortcomings of that process may be? And not knowing that there is going to be something on the other end that is delivered and is going to improve what it is you're doing creates a lot of fear. And the third challenge is that knowledge is power. And those who are in those rooms possess all of the knowledge and all of the power. And so there's not a single individual who is in that room who benefits directly from letting others in. Now, there is a benefit longer term, and the mediator certainly wants to get peace. These folks are there, that's their job, that's what determines whether or not their paycheck, people feel that they're worth their paycheck. But until you know that that's going to make a difference, that's not enough to give up the information that you possess, give away power for that peace dividend. And that's an incredibly strong disincentive to changing the way we build peace today. So what can we all do? Well, my organization does a great deal of advocacy to change the way peace is built. And our advocacy takes several forms. We do a lot of research. A lot of the examples I mentioned for you this evening are derivative of our research to look at whether or not it made a difference and how it made a difference. We do a lot of meetings. We bring a lot of the people we believe are authentic leaders to the policymakers to have those conversations. But that's fairly technical, and that's not all your day jobs. I think, though, there are 4 things that I would say you can help us do in driving this process forward. The first is to question the status quo. Question the way things are done. Question whether or not it could be different, it could be better. And provide ideas about how to improve those and make those solutions better, and continue to ask those questions until it becomes more difficult to keep them the same than it does to change them. The second is call for change in the process. Ask for people to do things differently and make it less difficult. Make people not feel as though they have to fight an uphill battle in order to do things in another way. Because once people feel that there is an opportunity and that people will embrace change, it will change the willingness of those folks to do things in a different way, to be creative, and to try for different solutions. Third, raise attention and awareness of other actors, women, civil society, academics, service providers, who are there and who are the true constituencies for peace in conflict-ridden societies. Raise this question of who you want to build your peace in society. Who will restore that culture of peace? Force policymakers to think longer term about where you plant those seeds and how you move that agenda forward. And lastly, promulgate and push for that creation of a culture of peace, not only in your daily lives and in your jobs, but even in the conversations that you have with neighbors when you're talking about the way peace is built. Because until there's a general recognition that we all need to be involved in returning peace into societies, we're not going to change the way these peace processes are approached. And we're not going to leverage the impact and the influence that people like women can have in helping to return peace and prosperity to these cultures all around the world, who otherwise are not leveraging 50% of their population in their efforts to end conflict. I think I'll close just by saying that I'm probably in the right room when I encourage all of you to take a long look when you're thinking about peace building. We need to change the way people think about a negotiating table, not to think about stopping fighting, but to think about how a negotiating table builds peace. When we arrive at the point where we have that longer look at the peace negotiation process, we will begin to open the door to the involvement of women and other stakeholders critical to building that culture. Thank you very much.